It's January 20th, 330 BC, and we're at the pass of the Zagros Mountains, near the present-day Iranian city of Yasuj, a city of 100,000. Back then, it was called the Persian Gate, and opened the way to the capital of the Persian Empire, Persepolis. All that remains today is an archaeological site, but back then, it was the center of the world's most powerful and richest empire. It was at the Persian Gate that one of the key battles of Alexander III's campaign culminated. Macedonian, now known as Alexander the Great, to Persia. The then 25-year-old Macedonian king had begun this monstrous undertaking 4 years earlier, and now it seems he has his goal within reach. He aims at nothing less than to subdue all Persia, which at that time extended from the Himalayas to Egypt, and to become, in the knowledge of the world at that time, the sole and unquestioned king of all Asia. The results of Alexander's campaign so far are astonishing. The reigning Persian king, Darius, had already narrowly escaped 2 major battles. Alexander completely dominated the most important part of Egypt, and virtually all of what is now Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. The largest city in the world at that time, Babylon, a city of 1 million, was given over to him completely without a fight. And now he has Persepolis, the heart of the Persian Empire, in his realms. But it's not as easy as it first seemed. The ruler of the local province, Ariobarzanes, has blocked the way through the Persian Gate with a high wall, luring Alexander's unwary troops into a trap. The Macedonian king had never suffered such heavy losses in the entire campaign. For a month he tried in vain to overwhelm the brave defenders of the pass. It was only when members of the local hill tribes showed him a secret path by which he and part of his army could outflank the enemy, and then attack from 2 sides, that the result finally came. Ariobarzanes and his fellow warriors are slain, and the road to Persepolis is clear. Here, Alexander mines a fabulous treasure trove of state. Among other things, he has 5 tons of gold shipped from here, which will make him the richest man in the world, and his next campaign will never need funding from home. Furthermore, 4 months later, during one of the uncontrolled drinking nights he has always indulged in, he is persuaded to set fire to the magnificent royal palace. The most precious part of the city will be burnt to the ground, and his soldiers will complete the work of destruction by being allowed to slaughter all the men and sell the women into slavery. It's unusual, because the city itself has opened its gates to Alexander, and he has always been benevolent to such people. But here it is a symbol. 150 years ago, the Persians defeated the Greeks at Thermopylae and reached Athens. Alexander claims Greek roots, and his thousands of Greek soldiers know this well. And so now, years later, revenge is finally complete. Alexander was born in 356 BC in the capital of the Macedonian kingdom of Pella, about 50 kilometers from Thessaloniki. Both his parents are worthy of separate mention. His father, Philip II, Philip of Macedon, was king of Macedonia. He elevated his country to an unprecedented level, and later, in Alexander's lifetime, even managed to militarily defeat the most powerful Greek city-states, led by Athens. He then united them all, except Sparta, in the so-called Corinthian League, which he himself headed. By the time Alexander came of age, his father was master of virtually all of Greece. 2 years later, however, he would be murdered by his bodyguard and apparently lover, Pausanias. His mother, Olympias, came from the family of the king of Epirus, a territory roughly in the area of present-day Albania. She was an impetuous and ambitious woman, much disliked at Philip's court, and in fact, even her husband, who had 4 other wives, gradually began to shun her. Olympias made it her main goal in life to win the succession for their son Alexander, and was willing to do practically anything to achieve it. There is still speculation about her involvement in the murder of her husband Philip, and she had his other wife and young son burned to death. She will survive her son Alexander, and seek revenge on those she believes were involved in his death. However, she too will be stoned to death by the families of her many victims just before she turns 60. But let's go back some 25 years again. Alexander is 15, and his father is providing him with the best education possible. His mentor is one of the greatest philosophers of antiquity, Aristotle. It is he who gives young Alexander a basic knowledge of all the major sciences, a deep general overview, excellent independent thinking, and a wealth of social skills. Alexander is well prepared theoretically for his life's mission, but he still seems too young and inexperienced. However, this is only valid until the age of 18. That's when his father gives him his first big assignment in battle, and the most important one at that. At Chaeronea, in the fight for all against a coalition of Greek Athens and Thebes, young Alexander leads the Macedonian cavalry so masterfully that he completely decimates the so-called Holy Troop, an elite Theban unit made up of 150 gay couples, whose reputation stemmed from the fact that the soldiers were capable of almost superhuman bravery for their lover fighting alongside them. When Alexander's father is murdered 2 years later, the dominated Greek city-states and surrounding tribes feel that the time is right to rid themselves of Macedonian rule. And here Alexander once again shows a decisiveness that few would expect from a young man of 20. He suppresses all rebellions harshly, and even has the famous Thebans razed to the ground. Then he has the Greeks confirm his loyalty to the Corinthian League as Philip had established it a year and a half earlier. At that point, he is free to undertake his life's task, the campaign into Persia that his father had already planned, but not carried out. Alexander sailed across the Hellespont, today's Dardanelles, to the Asian shore in May 334 BC. A campaign that will go down in history begins. Alexander will lead 40,000 men, on foot and on horseback, on a journey of more than 30,000 kilometers. It will take 12 years, and it will be a journey from success to success. Alexander will not be defeated even once, and at the end of it all, at his feet will lie an empire as vast as any European had ever imagined. In the first 4 years of his mission, he will defeat the armies of King Darius III of Persia 3 times head-on, conquer the ports of what are now Syria and Lebanon, thus depriving the Persians of naval influence, reach Egypt, the sacred sites of the ancient empire, and establish Alexandria on the coast, a port where 4 million people now live, and through which 80% of Egypt's exports and imports pass. Some cities, such as Tyre or Gaza, he has sacked and the inhabitants slaughtered or sold into slavery without mercy. Elsewhere, he acts generously to establish good relations with the local rulers. For without their cooperation, it is impossible to administer or maintain such a vast empire. By the beginning of 330 BC, Alexander is in Persepolis and has almost everything he desired. Only one thing worries him. King Darius is still on the run, and without Alexander catching him, capturing him, and forcing him to formally abdicate and hand over power, his triumph is not completed, and so the pursuit begins. This takes Alexander north into what is now Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Here he has to face a hitherto unknown problem, the displeasure of his troops. The soldiers, and many of the commanders, considered the whole mission accomplished, and instead of trudging through inaccessible mountainous regions, increasingly distant from what they were used to, they longed for orders to return. And all the more so when they discovered that the Persian king was dead. Yes, Darius, meanwhile, had taken refuge with Bessus, ruler of Bactria, an empire in what is now Afghanistan. But Bessus betrayed the king and had him killed to ingratiate himself with Alexander. He then treated the dead king with respect. He had his remains taken to the royal tomb and buried with full honors. But when the treacherous Bessus fell into his hands, he ordered his ears and nose to be cut off, and then had him crucified, thus mutilated, at the place of his treachery. At that time, Alexander had already conquered the whole of Persia, but his ambition drove him even further, to India, to an unexplored and wild land, not only exotic but also incomprehensible to Europeans, full of wars between local rulers and all kinds of natural hazards. Here, he had to face resistance as fierce as he had hardly experienced on his campaign. Among other things, his enemies sent fighting elephants against him, and the morale of Alexander's men steadily declined. He himself resorted to ever greater cruelties in this difficult situation. Eventually, he had to abandon his goal of reaching the great outer sea. It was simply too much for his troops. Then it was back to Persia. Part of Alexander's army sailed by sea. The rest, including Alexander himself, set out in 2 streams overland. But even that was not without its problems. The European soldiers watched with increasing displeasure as Alexander found a taste for Oriental customs, and as he added more and more Persians to his army, including his elite cavalry. His demand that those who came before him, including Europeans, kneel and press their foreheads to the ground, following the Persian model, aroused particular resentment. To the free-thinking Greeks, this was humiliation of the grossest kind. Alexander even had his own historian Callisthenes, the great nephew of his teacher Aristotle, executed when he tried to talk him out of Oriental worship. At the age of 32, he apparently already considered himself a demigod, which, incidentally, he had always been inclined to do. In 323 BC, Alexander returns to Babylon. He begins planning a new campaign, this time to Arabia, and then to Sicily, Italy, and even Gibraltar. However, in May, he falls ill, and his condition begins to deteriorate rapidly. Exactly what was going on is uncertain. It could have been Nile fever, the effects of prolonged heavy drinking, or one of the many wounds he had sustained in battles in which he never held back but always fought at the head of his men. He may also have been poisoned. According to various sources, either the poisonous white sneezeweed plant mixed into the wine or arsenic would be the most likely. In any case, a month before his 33rd birthday, in June 323 BC, Alexander the Great lies on his deathbed in Babylon, with his top officers gathered around him. They have only one question: who will rule over your empire? The strongest one, answers the exhausted Alexander. These are his last words, and we can probably imagine what will follow.